If you're wondering why I've got 3 microphones on, it's because this is also being recorded as part of a DVD extra, apparently, which would be very nice for somebody. But I'm here to talk about digital animation. But before I started, I thought it might be nice if I just made sure we were all on the same page when we were talking about what digital animation in Japan was actually replacing. So I want to talk a little bit first about cell animation. This is a nice sailor with nothing behind him. And the reason for that is because one of the great advantages of cell animation is you can put the background in on a different piece of plastic. So what we have here is a single piece of plastic in which someone has drawn in acrylic paint. And in the bad old days, back in 1918, back in 1920, back when they had to draw every single frame 24 times a second in order to get animation right, if I wanted to draw a sailor on the bridge of a submarine, this is from the Silent Service, by the way, those of you who know your Japanese fascist films, I would have to draw him and the bridge behind him every single time. But then the world of cells came along, and this lovely cellular stuff made it very good, because what I can do, if I want to put a background behind him, here is a background of some men sitting on chairs, maybe familiar to you, and I just stick it behind him, and there we go. Look, he's standing in front of a load of people from the Sci-Fi London Film Festival. So what you do with these cells is you put them onto a flat surface. You put them on a rostrum, which is a flat surface, with a camera above it looking down. And you can put up to 5 cells onto one of these things before they start to look a bit murky and you have to start worrying about whether your lighting's going to work properly or anything like that. And the brilliant thing about cells is you only have to draw the background for him in that scene once. You put the background down, you put him on top of it, you shoot it. Then you take him off and you put a new version of him, just moved just 1 frame on, or you take off his mouth and you put a different mouth on so the mouth movements change in the process of a second. And you build up the image that you want. But the great thing for Japanese animators is they can take a lot more time on the backgrounds. They can fiddle around with getting really good cases of sky, really good, fiddly details in the background. It makes it look like they've drawn it every single frame for every single second. In fact, they've only drawn it once. But the thing about the film business is it runs on gimmickry. There are 2 things that filmmakers always try and do all around the world. One of them is that they want you to come into a cinema. They'll find some kind of gimmick to make you go and see it. I mean, there was a time when anamorphic and colour was just a gimmick. And so filmmakers will try and use these gimmicks as a way not only of getting you into the cinemas, but also if they find that it saves them money in the way that cell animation saves them money, they will use it as often as possible, because money is always an important thing if you're a producer. Now, the first place in the history of Japanese animation that I've been able to find computer animation being used. I don't know if you know the story of Tron. It's about, a man gets compressed to the size of a pixel, thrown into a machine where he fights against evil viruses and evil computer programs, and it used this false colour process where they coloured everything in to make everybody look a bit blue, which was nice. But that wasn't the clever thing. They also used very, very primitive computer graphics. And normally people would probably not have paid much attention, but the Japanese animation business were paying a lot of attention. And the reason is they already knew who the director of Tron was. He was a man called Steven Lisberger. And I'm getting a thumbs up from Jim. Thank you, Jim. He rocks, apparently. But the reason that he rocked as far as the Japanese were concerned was because of something he made in 1979. In 1979, he made a film called Animalympics. No, nobody. Oh, yes, I got a thumbs up from Jake. Hey! So, the thing about Animalympics was it was a cartoon, and because it was a cartoon, it was covered in the Japanese press. And the people who worked in the Japanese animation business in 1979 knew who Steven Lisberger was. And they were really impressed that he goes and makes a cartoon, which they're used to making, because Japanese animators like animation, and then he gets to make a live-action film with real actors. And what really impressed them when Steven Lisberger got to make Tron was that he'd been an animator, and now, all of a sudden, he was working with real actors, and he was playing with this computer graphics thing. So we get people in the Japanese animation business going, well, if we did that, if we played with computer graphics as well, then maybe we'd have the chance to get to work on real films as well. So one of these people, not necessarily who didn't want to work in the business, just one of these people who thought computer graphics was an interesting gimmick, was a man called Osamu Dezaki. And at the time that Tron came out, he was working on a film called Golgo 13. Yes. And the thing about Golgo 13 was he decided he was going to stick some computer animation in there, and I'm going to show you that in a few minutes. And the trouble is that computers are expensive and computers are rare. We're talking about 1982. We're talking about a time where if you wanted to go down to whatever the Jurassic period equivalent of PC World was and buy yourself a computer in England, you were going to have a ZX Spectrum. In Japan at this point, that people were still writing scripts by hand. There were no word processors in use, in general use. The first anime I ever translated was something called Chaos Century Beast Warriors, and that was made in 1992. And when I got the script, it was 150 pages. It was handwritten. So computers are difficult to find, and you're not going to be able to make a 70 or 80-minute movie using computers. You're going to have to find a part of the film where you can use computer graphics and show off. And it's going to be another 5 years in 1982 before we get realistic human body movement. It's going to be another 10 years before we have realistic human faces. So they have to find something else. And Osamu Dezaki said, OK, well, what we'll do, buildings, they don't move very much. So we can make them with computer animation. And vehicles, they do move, but they're kind of solid objects. They don't have fingers, they don't have mouths. That's quite handy. So we'll get helicopters flying through a city. We can do that with computer graphics. You'll see the most amazing thing about that is the jarring contrast between cell animation and computer animation. It's really obvious, as you can see. Now, the thing is, at the time, for Osamu Dezaki, that was all right. He wanted it to be obvious. He wanted people to come out of his film and have something to talk about. And it's kind of worked, because it's 20 years on, and I'm still talking about his film. So it's done the trick. It's publicity for the film. It's worked. But it's still a gimmick. And there are other ways of using gimmicks. Now, in television, around about the same time, actually, I've got the date here, 1984, so we're moving on a year or so. There's a man called Yoshiaki Kawajiri, and he's making a television series called Lensman. And the Golgo 13 was a movie. Lensman, TV series. And the problem with TV series is that budgets are always being squeezed. Now, as a rough rule of thumb, it costs about £80,000 to make a 30-minute TV episode. And round about that time, in the 1980s, the TV channels were prepared to pay £75,000 for a TV episode, which meant that if you were an animator and you were making one, you were already £5,000 in debt before you'd even started. And that's not good. So they find ways of dealing with this problem. They find ways of shaving money off the budget. The first one, the obvious one, is that I said 30 minutes. It's not 30 minutes at all. It's 25 minutes because there's an ad break in the middle. Aha, we've already conned them out of 5 minutes. Then, what if we have closing credits, which is just a still picture with the credits rolling up in front of it? Well, if we do that, that means that we don't have to animate that bit, and so we've saved another 2 minutes. So now we're down to 23 minutes. If we have transforming robots, or a superhero, or a normal person turning into a superhero, and there's a transformation sequence, we only have to make that transformation sequence once. We put all of our efforts into making a really nice minute, and then we use that 26 times. Or if it's a successful series, 52 times. It works very well. Pokemon's at episode 400 or something, they're using the same transformation sequences over and over again. That's money for nothing. The other thing, of course, is you still want to impress people. You want to get your TV series repeated, because every time it's repeated, you get repeat fees and you can bring your budget back up. You want to find something about your TV series that makes people want to come in and watch it. They turn on the television, they see it opening up and think, oh, this is good, I'll stay, I'll watch this, and that puts your ratings up. So what Yoshiaki Kawajiri did is he decided to use computer graphics once again to show off. And we're still talking about 1984, so we're still talking about a time when you could only really have big lumps of stuff. You couldn't have fiddly things, you couldn't have human animation, you couldn't have hair, you couldn't have little bugs walking around. It had to be big things that didn't have too many moving parts, like spaceships, handily enough. And so he put all of his effort into making sequences of spaceships that he could use in the opening credits of Lensman. Now, Lensman, the TV series, was never released in this country, but we did get the movie edit, which, because it's a movie, they used all the most expensive stuff they could find. If you're working with cell animation, there are things that you can do with animation which would be almost impossible with live action, either for budgetary reasons or physical reasons. So, if you want to draw If you want to make a film about a man sitting in a room, all you need is a camera and a man sitting in a room. It's quite cheap to do with live action. But if you want to do a film about a giant spaceship the size of a planet blowing up and sending out robot minions all over the world to kill and destroy, suddenly that becomes quite difficult with live action. That becomes quite expensive. So instead, what you do is you just draw it. A pot of paint costs the same. Special effects are very, very cheap in anime. And this is why animation all over the world tends to skew towards fantasy and science fiction. It's playing to its strengths. Now, there's a flip side to that, which means there are some things in the animation world which are very, very difficult to do, but they're easy in live action. So, there are ways of showing that this is an important moment in time, and one of them is something called a contra-zoom. How that works is we have a dolly track, we have a little railway track to the back, and we stick a camera on the dolly tracks, and we move it away from me really fast. And as we move it away from me, we zoom in with the lens. So the effect is camera's moving back, lens is moving forward. I don't appear to change at all. I'm still in focus. But because the focal length is changing, the background behind me seems to waver and twist. And you get this in quite a few films, especially the horror films, when there's some terrible, shocking moment. And sometimes the audience doesn't realise it's going on. They just feel that something has changed and they can't put their finger on it. If you wanted to do focus pull changes with animation, you'd have to draw somebody fuzzy. And then you'd have to draw them sharp. And you'd have to draw the background fuzzy. You'd have to draw the background sharp. So if you're Mamoru Oshii or Shoji Kawamori or Katsuhiro Otomo, all directors who love playing with lenses in the real world, if you want to have a fisheye lens effect or something like that, it's not going to work. You're going to actually have to draw somebody all fish-eyed like that for it to actually work properly. So they found a way of using computer graphics to distort things. They were able to add lens flares to make it look as if the camera had just accidentally gone into the sun. They were able to use contra-zooms, fisheye lens effects, droplets of rainwater suddenly refracting light. All very difficult to do with live action. Easy to do with computer graphics if you can combine the computer graphics with the original cell. So the thing about the Avid online editing suite, it's very common today, used in radio, used in TV commercials, used in television. But back then, Mamoru Oshii had his hands on one of the first ones, and he was bloody well going to use it. And he realised that instead of photographing these cells with a camera, one image at a time, he could simply scan them into the computer. So the process of trial and error that you have with these kind of cells suddenly becomes a lot easier, and you're allowed to fiddle with the images that you have. And we're talking in the middle of the 90s about a time when the press, not the normal mainstream press, but the film industry press, was alive with people talking about this great new remastered version of Star Wars. And I mean the original 3 films from the 1970s and early 1980s. And people at Industrial Light and Magic were finessing the images, cleaning up the prints, adding extra special effects. And it became common knowledge in the animation business that some of these people at Industrial Light and Magic were not only cleaning up the X-Wing fighters attacking the Death Star, but they were taking the liberty of scanning their faces onto the X-Wing pilots. So that if you got a copy of the film and you blew it up 50 times, you could point yourself out. During the 1990s, people like Katayama were slowly taking over the anime business. I don't mean nutters, necessarily. I mean people who had a background in computing. But producers are still trying to save money. Don't forget, this is the time I was talking about earlier when TV channels are actually paying you less for something than it's actually worth. So in order to save money, they started moving their operations out of Japan. The key animators and the directors and the writers, they'd all be Japanese. But the people at the lower end of the scale, the in-betweeners and the colorists, they would be people in Korea and the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. And nobody really foresaw what effect this would have until it was too late. What it meant is that over time, a generation grew up working in the Japanese animation industry who didn't have these basic skills. What they did have was the knowledge of computers, because every 18 months the prices of computers are halving, the computer power is doubling. And there came a point in 1997 when suddenly it was cheaper for the Toei studio in Tokyo to go and buy 200 computers, plug them in and get mouse monkeys moving stuff around on the screen, than it was to send all their stuff by FedEx over to Korea and get a load of shift workers to do it for a pittance. So, because Mamoru Oshii has already shown us that we can scan cells in and use an editing suite to do online editing, they realised that actually they could draw the cells, they didn't need to colour them in. They'll scan them in, they'll colour them in later, they'll use a computer to do it. And so this changed the way that the business worked. And because computer power was always increasing, it got to the point where suddenly it was possible to make a full-length film using computer animation. But all the old school animators, well most of them, they've gone elsewhere. We're talking about a time now when computer games are the place where people are being trained to work with this new media. So you look at Resident Evil, we look at Final Fantasy, and we see there's suddenly a whole group of new talents coming into the industry. And these people also learned how to use motion capture. Now, for those who don't know, just to quickly recap, motion capture is where, if you're Peter Jackson and you need some orcs to run around, you can't find any real orcs outside of Birmingham, so what you have to do is you get a load of actors to wear these suits. Normally you only have one suit and you share it around, and it's about £70,000 or £80,000, and it's a suit with a load of wires and points all over it, and the computer can read you. It can read what you do when you move around in the suit, and it can put it into a computer. And there's a little version of you made out like a little stick man, and it moves the way that you do, like that. Obviously I'm not moving that way now, but if I did and didn't have any knees, that's how I'd move. And then they can put it in an orc costume and have it run around. Wicked, lovely. Trouble is that doesn't always work. Motion capture and computer animation does have its own set of problems. Now, if you're Peter Jackson and you've got cash to spare, you can have the expensive top-of-the-range kit which has the wires coming out the small of your back. And that means you can do all the moving. You can't turn around like this too often because you get tangled up in your cable. Now, I worked on something, on a game called Halcyon Sun about 3 years ago, and we didn't have the kind of money that Peter Jackson had. We had to use the bog standard kind of Amstrad version of the motion capture suit. And the trouble with that is that the wires came out of your ankles. Now, the Japanese had this problem themselves. Obviously, they were still trying to save money. The next clip I'm going to show you is from one of the earliest full-length animated films to be made using computer graphics and using these people from the computer games industry. In fact, it was written by the man who did the storyline for Shenmue, and which the Japanese added an E to for some reason, and everyone calls it Shenmue. It's not Shenmue. You'll notice, well, if you've played a computer game, you'll be ready for it, but if you haven't, you'll notice that they don't look like animated characters anymore. They look more like puppets. And puppetry becomes an important new tool for understanding how to use these people in film, this technology in films. When Jerry Anderson made Four Feather Falls back in the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, it was a cowboy series with puppets. And he realised that the real problem was that puppets walk like this, and it's very annoying. So he said, well, I'm going to make science fiction. He went off and he made Thunderbirds, he made Captain Scarlet. And if people are on escalators and people are riding around in spaceships, they don't have to move below the waist. It makes it that much easier to make them look more realistic. Now, the scene I'm going to show you now is the opening sequence from the film from Alice. And you'll see these kind of problems being circumvented by very clever animators. They keep people in their vehicles as often as possible. They cut away fast so that you don't get a chance to really register when something's not working right. And it's two girls on a kind of snow speeder thing being chased by an army of faceless minions. And that's the great thing about faceless minions. They don't have faces. And that means they don't have mouths, and you don't have to worry about getting the animation right. by 2000, there's another full-length live-action film released in Japan, computer-generated film coming out in Japan called Blue Remains. Not very well known abroad because it was only shown on a couple of screens in Japan, gently sunk without a trace, although it is coming out in this country later on this year, as is Alice, by the way. And the thing about Blue Remains is that if you are an animator working with the kind of puppet-like limitations that we've just seen there, with an experience working on Final Fantasy and working on Resident Evil and moving these kind of computer-generated characters around, you look for ways of making your life easier, and you can do that with the plotting. So Blue Remains is about a girl who's the daughter of a family of terraformers who come back to Earth in the middle of a nuclear war and end up living underwater. And the great thing about being underwater is that human motion is quite slow. Handy. If your best friend's a dolphin, which is also quite handy, dolphins move like this. They don't have fingers, they don't have lips that talk, unlike, well, some dolphins do, but... So what you get is dolphins undulating like that, and you get people swimming around, easier to do than people jumping and running and walking. You also, when you're underwater, have this brilliant lack of depth perception because the further away you look underwater, the bluer everything is. So instead of worrying about what stuff's going to look like in the distance and whether you're going to have any little tiny pixels wandering around just far off for people to notice, you can just have nothing. You can have all your action happening in the foreground, and then in the background there's a load of blue. And that's normal. And so hopefully Nick's got it queued up, and I can just show you a little clip from Blue Remains. So I suppose now's as good a time as any for me to talk to you about Malice Doll and what it's like. Because Malice Doll is a rather low-budget affair. They make, it was made by a very small group of filmmakers, and it was originally made straight to video. But it was written by a very clever man called Chiaki Konaka, who you may know as the screenwriter of Armitage III. And he did what Osamu Dezaki did and what Yoshiaki Kawajiri did. He found a way of playing to the strengths, of making the weaknesses of the budget they had and the time they had and turning them into advantages. So he sits them down and he goes, right, so how can we make this film use what we've got to play with? And the animator said, well, we're having a bit of trouble. Movement's a bit stiff at the moment. Our motion capture suits are a bit cheap. Like we got them off Jonathan Clements. He goes, oh, okay, well, okay, I'll write that one down. Expressions are frozen. The characters are quite expressionless at the moment. We can't afford, we don't have the time to have proper movement all the time in the characters' faces. He goes, okay, expressionless characters. And he goes, well, because the skin looks a bit plasticky. And he goes, right, well, what about if we make it about dolls? We make a film about dolls, and then if they look plasticky and they move a little bit stiffly and their faces are expressionless, then they'll be dolls. They'll be wicked. And they said, well, hang on a minute, Jackie, we're not that bad. We can actually give them, real-looking limbs, real-looking flesh, proper movement on the faces. And he goes, okay, we'll do it about a doll who turns into a real person. Ah. And they realise why writers get paid, because what he's done is he's taken a load of things that could have been an absolute disaster and he's put them to good use. He's made them part of the story. What they also do is they make very extensive use of shadow, very extensive use of montages. Quite often there's a still moment, a bit like that. Now, if you leave something still for too long, like Gynax and Evangelion for 60 seconds, then people realise that you're ripping them off. So what they do in Malice Doll is they move very quickly between different still images to give the illusion of movement. And we know this works. There's a film called La Jetée that was made a long time ago using almost nothing but still images, and it works very well. And it's by a man called Chris Marker. And they've basically ripped off what Chris Marker did in La Jetée to try and move their story along as cheaply as they possibly could. Quite ironically, where Golgo 13 tried to make cell animation look posh by adding computer graphics, Malice Doll makes computer graphics look posh by adding cell animation. There are moments in the film where someone has come in and drawn by hand little wiggly tentacles or fronds of grass or whatever to make it look that much more impressive. And the end result is a very interesting film as part of the history of computer animation in Japan. Unfortunately, it was delayed just by a few weeks because it's a computer. If you've got it on your desk, you'll fiddle with it. You'll say, well, it's not quite finished. We'll just do one more thing. We'll just do one more thing. Give it another week. We'll have that shot right. It'll be sorted. And it was delayed just that little bit too long because the third film being made in the same year as Blood the Last Vampire and Malice Doll was Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, which cost $150 million and wiped the floor with everything. And that's the problem. Because by the time in 2001 that Malice Doll was originally released in Japan, the hype was up in the air for Final Fantasy. And everyone's talking about Final Fantasy, and everyone's talking about the motion capture in Final Fantasy and how much money it cost and how it was going to make, it was going to be really successful, apparently. It was going to be really successful. And so Malice Doll kind of sunk without a trace. And it's basically been rescued by its UK distributor because the form in which you're going to see it tonight, which is a full-length feature, is something that they've managed to concoct from the original Malice Doll footage. Now, Chiaki Konaka, he's not that fussed. He says that he got nice critical acclaim for Malice Doll when it came out. People appreciated it. The art house crowd liked it. He liked it. But it just didn't sell very well for him. So you're very fortunate that someone's actually managed to get a copy out of the country and release it here. Now, that was me telling you about Malice Doll. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to say something about, to round up about the way that computer animation is perceived. Then we'll have time for questions, and if anyone wants to run out to the loo, it's a good time to do it. And then Malice Doll is going to start. And just to conclude then, what I want to talk about is people's perception of what works and what doesn't work in animation. Because in 1920 and the 1930s, when cell animation first came in, everybody said it was monstrous. People said, it's not real cartoons unless you draw everything in every single frame 24 times a second. These cells, they're an abomination. They don't work. It's not right. It's not normal. And people are saying the same things now about computer graphics. They're saying, no, real animation is done with cells. If you don't use cells, then there's something wrong with you. It's just a gimmick. It's never going to catch on. But I think because of the things I've been talking about, like the fall in the price of computers and the rise in people talented in animation and the rise of computer games, computer animation is here to stay. And although people would think that computer animation is not really right, they're going to have to live with it because it's going to turn up eventually. It is going to be around. And the only thing, the film business always changes. It always fiddles around with stuff. It always tries these new gimmicks. They will always try and find the path of least resistance. They will always try and play to their strengths and find gimmicks to get you to go to a cinema. The only thing that doesn't change in the anime business all the time is its ability to impress and entertain us. And thank you very much.